Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of In-Laws Out Loud. It's just me today, and every now and again you'll hear either me or Baljeet doing an episode on our own. We're both really busy, and sometimes finding the time when we can actually sit down together isn't easy. So doing the odd episode separately means we can keep the podcasts coming. Today's episode actually came about because a listener got in touch and asked whether we would ever talk about younger Asian widows. We ended up having quite a long conversation, and as she was telling us about her life, we realised how little we really talk about the person who's left behind when their husband or wife dies. We quite rightly talk about the person we've lost. We remember them, and we talk about what they were like, the things they did, and the memories we have of them, and how much we're going to miss them. Around the time of a death and funeral, the house can be full of people. The phone doesn't stop ringing, people are visiting, and everyone is asking what they can do to help. And then the funeral is over. The weeks pass, and then the months. And eventually, everyone else gets back to their own lives. But the person who's lost their husband or wife doesn't have their old life to go back to. And that's what I really want to talk about today. Although this conversation started because a younger Asian widow contacted us, this isn't only about widows. Widowers lose the person they expected to grow old with too. And I certainly don't want this episode to suggest that men somehow feel the loss of their wives any less deeply. What I do think is interesting, particularly in our culture, is the way the person left behind can be treated differently, depending on whether they're a man or a woman. The lady who contacted me lost her husband a few years ago, and I'm deliberately not going to give you any details about her because she trusted me with her story and I want her to remain anonymous. But she described her husband as her best friend. He was her whole life. They'd been together from a very young age. They'd built their adult lives together, raised their children, shared all those ordinary things that make up a marriage, and expected to grow old together. And then suddenly, he wasn't there. She was left trying to work out what her life was supposed to look like without the person she had expected to share it with. She said something that really saddened me. She told me that sometimes she and her children feel as though they're existing rather than living, just getting through one week and then the next. And there are even days when she looks forward to going to bed, because at least it means another day is finished. I think that tells you something about grief that we perhaps don't see from the outside. A person can get up in the morning, get dressed and go to work, and look after the children, answer messages on their phone, maybe laugh at something, and make dinner, and appear to be coping perfectly well. But functioning and actually enjoying your life are two very different things. She also talked about how the support gradually became less. And I don't think that necessarily means people stop caring about her. Life gets busy. Everyone has their own families and problems. And sometimes people simply don't know what to say anymore. They might worry that mentioning her husband will upset her. Or perhaps they think enough time has passed and she must be all right by now. But what exactly is enough time? If you spent most of your adult life with a person, 4 or 5 years might sound like a long time to everyone else. But it doesn't suddenly undo decades of having them beside you. You've lost the person you came home to, the person you talked to about all those little things that probably meant absolutely nothing to anyone else, the person you made decisions with, went to bed beside, woke up beside, maybe even argued with, and probably complained about occasionally as well. They may have been the one person who could look at your face and know something was wrong before you'd even opened your mouth. And I don't know how anyone could put a timescale on missing that. I haven't lost my husband, so I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I know what being a widow feels like, because I don't, and I can't even bear to think about it. But I have experienced grief, and I do know what it looks like when another person decides what your grief is supposed to look like. When I lost my dad, I went back to work after 2 weeks. Dad had passed away on a holiday in Punjab, so we didn't get to see him before he died. My dad was my life, and I was struggling terribly with losing him. But I thought perhaps going back to work might help me. Sitting at home wasn't going to bring him back, and I thought having something else to concentrate on might get me through the day. When I went back to the office, an Indian woman that I worked with came up to me and said, "I thought your dad died." And I said, "Yeah, he has." And she looked at me and said, "Then why are you wearing lipstick?" I can still remember exactly how that made me feel. I was barely holding myself together anyway, and I just broke. I almost started howling in the office. I couldn't stop crying, and eventually they had to send me home because I just couldn't pull myself together. But this woman had looked at the lipstick on my face and somehow decided that it told her something about how much I was grieving. Well, it didn't. I wasn't wearing lipstick because I didn't care that Dad had died. I was wearing lipstick because I had got up that morning, got dressed, put my makeup on, and gone to work. And that was it. But clearly, somewhere in her mind, there was an idea of what a grieving daughter should look like, and apparently I didn't look like it. And if a daughter can be judged for wearing lipstick after losing her father, just imagine the judgment that can be placed on a woman after she loses her husband. People can look at what she's wearing and notice that she's put makeup on, or they can see her laughing at a wedding or enjoying herself, and somehow use those things to decide how well she must be coping. But none of that tells you how she's actually feeling, or what happens when she goes home at the end of the evening and closes the door behind her. I've seen two women very close to me deal with losing their husbands in completely different ways. When my mum lost her husband, she was in Punjab. And when she came back, I went to Heathrow Airport to collect her. And I can still picture her coming through because I was absolutely shocked when I saw her. Her hair had gone completely white. For a moment, I thought I was looking at my grandmother. After losing her husband, Mum never kept her head uncovered. She always wore a white or cream chunni, and that became how she chose to dress. The only real exception I remember was when my brothers got married, and she wore a very light pink. And that was Mum's way of dealing with losing my dad. My mother-in-law was completely different after she lost my father-in-law. She didn't suddenly start wearing white, and she didn't keep her head covered all the time. In fact, it's only much more recently that she has started covering her head. Yet, I know my mother-in-law thinks about her husband every single day. So the fact that she didn't dress the same way as my mum certainly doesn't mean she loved her husband any less. Here were two women who had lost their husbands, and their grief looked completely different. And that, for me, is the important part. If my mum wanted to wear white or cream and keep her head covered, that was her choice. And if another widow wants to put on a bright red suit and wear lipstick or go to a wedding and dance, that should be her choice too. The problem comes when everyone else starts deciding what a widow is supposed to look like. And when you look back at the way widows have historically been treated in parts of South Asian society, perhaps you can understand where some of these expectations came from. The most extreme example most of us will have heard of is sati, the historical practice in some Hindu communities where a widow died on her husband's funeral pyre. It wasn't practiced by every Hindu community, it wasn't part of Sikhism, and it certainly wasn't the experience of every Indian widow. But there were women who were pressured or forced into it. Now, I'm not going to turn this into a history lesson about sati because that isn't what this podcast's about. I mention it because of what it represented. The most extreme version of an idea that when a woman's husband died, somehow her own life ended with his. Now, thankfully, that is history, but other expectations around widowhood continued for much longer. And if, like me, you grew up watching old Bollywood movies, you'd have seen some of those ideas played out on screen. And one film that immediately comes to my mind is Prem Rog. If you've seen it, you'll probably remember the actress Padmini Kulapuri playing an incredibly young woman who gets married and almost immediately becomes a widow. She's barely had a married life before her husband dies. And suddenly, everything changes. Her sindoor is aggressively wiped from her forehead, her glass bangles are broken, and the colour disappears from her clothes because she's expected to wear white. And then they want to shave her head. Now, what I found particularly interesting about that part of the film is that the elder women are the ones saying that her head should be shaved because that is what should happen to a widow. And it actually takes one of the men, the patriarch of the family, to step in and say no. He refuses to let them shave her head. Just think about that. This is a very young woman who's just lost her husband, And rather than asking how she feels or what she wants, the people around her are deciding what should happen to her clothes, her jewellery, her hair, and effectively how the rest of her life should look. And it takes a man to step in and stop the women from shaving her head. And I found that really interesting. When many of us watched films like Brem Roeg growing up, I don't think we sat there analysing what those scenes were teaching us. We just understood the imagery. A married woman had sindoor, bangles, jewellery and colour. And after her husband died, those things were taken away. The woman was still alive, but visually, so much of what represented her life, marriage and femininity was stripped from her. Now, Bollywood didn't invent those traditions. However, seeing those images repeatedly certainly made them familiar. And perhaps that's why, even though so much has changed, some of that judgment hasn't completely disappeared. The customs themselves may have gone from most people's lives, but the idea that a widow's appearance somehow tells us how much she is grieving can still creep into the way people think. It may be nothing more than a comment about lipstick or a colourful outfit or seeing her enjoying herself. But underneath it can be the same expectation that grief is supposed to look a particular way. And this is where I want to bring widowers into the conversation. Because I don't want to talk about the different expectations placed on widows and accidentally make it sound as though men simply lose their wives, remarry and carry on, because that would be unfair. A man can be absolutely devastated by the death of his wife. He's lost the woman he loved. Maybe she's the mother of his children, she's his companion, his best friend, and the person he expected to grow old with. There are widowers who never want another relationship. And then there are men who struggle terribly with loneliness after losing their wives. And there are probably men who don't even know how to talk about how devastated they are because they've spent their whole lives being told to be strong. So I'm not comparing the depth of the grief. I'm talking about the way other people can respond to what happens afterwards. When a relatively young man loses his wife, particularly when there are children involved, people can very quickly become concerned about how he'll cope on his own. They worry about the children, how he'll manage the home, and whether he'll be lonely. And eventually the conversation can turn to whether he should meet another woman. There are plenty of stories of men remarrying within a fairly short period after losing their wives, and generally people understand it. They may say he has young children, he needs support, he deserves companionship, and he shouldn't spend the rest of his life alone. And I don't disagree with any of that. But now turn it around. A woman loses her husband, and 5 years later, she meets another man, and suddenly the conversation can sound very different. People may decide it was too quick, question how she could be ready for another relationship, or even use it to judge how much she must have loved the husband she lost. 5 years later. How is 5 years quick? And actually, even if it were 2 years, who are we to decide? And that's the double standard I struggle with. A widower finding companionship can be seen as rebuilding his life, while a widow doing exactly the same thing can find herself having to justify it. Now I know a woman where this wasn't simply judgment from the wider community. Her own family effectively decided what the rest of her life was going to look like. She lost her husband when she was still in her late 20s, and she had 2 young children. Now just think about how young that is. She hadn't even reached 30, and she had already lost the man she thought she was going to grow old with. And the message from her parents was basically that this was her life now. She had her children, and she needed to concentrate on raising them, and that was that. Of course she needed to raise her children, but being a mother didn't mean she had stopped being a young woman with a life of her own. There was no reason she couldn't raise her children, love them, be a good mum, and perhaps one day have companionship again, if that was what she wanted. What I find difficult is that her future had been decided for her before she had even turned 30. And I can't help wondering whether the conversation would have been the same if it had been their son. If a young man in his late 20s lost his wife and was left with 2 children, I suspect the family would eventually be concerned that he was too young to spend the rest of his life alone. They might even begin thinking about finding him another wife. And there's the difference. I'm not saying the widower should be denied another relationship, quite the opposite. I believe they should both have the same freedom. If a widower wants to remarry, that's his decision. If he never wants another relationship, also his decision. And a widow should be given exactly the same choice. Then there's another side to widowhood that can become particularly complicated in South Asian families, and that's what happens to the relationship with the in-laws after the husband dies. We make such a big thing about daughters leaving home when they marry, especially in Punjabi families. There's all that emotion around the dolly, sending your daughter into another family, and certainly in previous generations, girls grew up hearing that once they married, their husband's home was now their home. His family became her family. So when he dies, where does that leave her? People can say she can go back to her parents, but life isn't always that simple. If you've been married for 10 years, have children, have built an entire adult life with your husband, your parents' house isn't automatically home anymore. Your parents may be elderly, and your siblings may have their own homes and families, and your children's lives may be centred somewhere completely different. And more importantly, why should a woman automatically have to leave the home she built with her husband simply because he's died? I know of one situation, in fact, Baljeet told me about this one, where a woman lost her husband, and after the funeral was over, her in-laws threw her out of the house. Just imagine that. You've just lost your husband. You're trying to understand how you're going to live without him, and then you lose your home as well. There was also blame directed towards her, and that's another uncomfortable thing that can happen when a son dies. Parents can be devastated and angry, and sometimes all that pain needs somewhere to go, and the daughter-in-law can become the person they blame, even when there is absolutely no logical reason for blaming her. Grief doesn't always make people behave rationally. So now this woman is grieving her husband, maybe trying to help her children cope with losing their father, and at the same time dealing with hostility from the family who have lost their son. And in this particular situation, there were children involved. The family wanted custody of the grandson, but they didn't show the same interest in the girls. I find that incredibly difficult. It was almost as though they were selecting which parts of their dead son's life they wanted to keep. They wanted the grandson, the boy who carried the family line, but his daughters and his wife were part of his life too. Now, I'm not saying every family behaves like this. Of course they don't. There are in-laws who absolutely stand by a widowed daughter-in-law, who support her, love her children, and genuinely continue to treat her as their own. But perhaps that's the real test of the phrase we hear so often. Our daughter-in-law is like our daughter. So if your son dies, does that relationship continue? And I don't mean for the first few months when everyone is grieving. I mean 2 years later or 5 years later. If she meets another man, or eventually she remarries, does she remain part of your family? Is she still invited to family occasions? And do you still ring her and maintain a relationship with the children? Because your son may no longer be there, but all the relationships built during that marriage don't have to die with him. And remarriage brings another difficult relationship into this conversation: adult children. Because sometimes it isn't the community or the in-laws who struggle when a widow or widower meets a new partner. Sometimes it's their own children. And I can understand that. If your dad dies, and a few years later your mum meets another man, seeing him sitting beside her might feel as though he's sitting in your dad's place. Or perhaps your mum dies, and eventually your dad has another woman beside him at family dinners, or weddings, or on holiday. Emotionally, that can feel as though your mum is somehow being replaced. But she isn't. A new partner cannot replace a parent, and a new relationship doesn't go backwards through a person's life and erase the marriage that came before it. The photographs are still there. All the memories are still there. The children and the grandchildren, they're all still there. And the person who died will always be a part of that family. But the parent who survived is still alive. And I think sometimes adult children understandably see everything through their own loss. You may have lost your dad while your mum has lost her husband. You may have lost your mum while your dad has lost his wife. Those losses are connected, but they're not the same relationship. The surviving husband or wife has lost the person they woke up beside and shared all the everyday bits of life with. So I think both feelings have to be allowed to exist. The adult children are allowed to find it difficult, and the widow or widower is allowed to continue living, because one doesn't cancel the other. And I've never really liked the phrase, moving on. It makes it sound as though you have shut a door on the person who died, put that part of your life away and started again. I think moving forward probably describes it better, because you take that person with you. A widow can meet another man, fall in love, and still miss her husband, and likewise with a widower. He can meet another woman, build a life with her, and still love the wife he lost. Human beings are capable of holding more than one feeling, and one love doesn't erase another. There's also something else we don't talk about very openly, particularly when the person who's been widowed is a woman. Companionship, affection, and intimacy. A woman doesn't stop wanting those things just because her husband has died. If you lose your husband in your 40s or 50s, you could potentially have another 30 or 40 years of life ahead of you. Wanting a person to go on holiday with, or talk to at the end of the day, or simply put their arm around you, doesn't mean you have somehow forgotten the husband you lost. If a widow decides she never wants another relationship, then that is completely her choice. Some people lose their husband or wife and genuinely never want another partner, and there's nothing wrong with that. But another person may be desperately lonely, and there's nothing wrong with wanting companionship either. And the same applies to widowers. Neither response tells us how much they love the person who died. I know what I would want if I died before my husband. I wouldn't want him spending the rest of his life miserable, because he thought that somehow that proved how much he loved me. Obviously, I'd expect him to talk about me constantly, and tell everyone how fabulous I was. And knowing me, I'd probably leave written instructions somewhere, just to make sure he did. But seriously, I'd want him to live. I'd want him to enjoy our children and grandchildren, and go out and have people around him. And if eventually another woman came into his life and made him happy, I wouldn't want our children making him feel guilty for that. I'd hope they would understand that loving her didn't mean he had stopped loving me, or that the life we'd had together suddenly meant any less. For younger widows and widowers with children, there's another huge part of losing a spouse that the rest of us probably don't see. You don't get to stop being a parent because you're grieving. Normal family life still carries on. The children need you. School still happens. Bills are still arriving, and all the everyday things that were once shared between two people are suddenly sitting with one. And at the same time, those children have lost a parent. And children don't all deal with grief in the same way either. One child might want to talk about mum or dad all the time, while another doesn't want to talk about them at all. One might become angry, another might seem to be coping perfectly well, and the parent who's left behind is trying to work out how to help each of them while dealing with their own loss at the same time. We often look at people in that position and tell them how strong they are. And maybe they are, but sometimes what we call strength is simply a person who hasn't been given another choice. The lady who originally contacted me is getting her children through their lives because she has to. But when she tells me there are days when going to bed feels like a relief because another day is over, that tells me there's a huge difference between functioning and actually being okay. There's a practical side to all of this as well. A couple may have spent years dividing life between them without even thinking about it. One might have dealt with the money, while the other dealt with something completely different. Suddenly, the person left behind could be trying to understand the bills, the mortgage, insurance, pensions, at the same time as trying to understand how their husband or wife can simply not be there anymore. And then there's work. If you have younger children, perhaps the way you worked depended on there being two parents. One of you could do the school run while the other worked later, or you organised everything between you without giving it much thought. Suddenly, all of that needs working out again. I think this is one reason why telling a widow or widower, "Let me know if you need anything," while very well meant, doesn't always help as much as we think it does. When your head is all over the place, you might not even know what you need, and you certainly may not feel comfortable ringing people and asking them to do things for you. Sometimes it's easier for friends and family to simply offer something they can actually do. You might take the children for an afternoon, or bring some food over, or maybe help with something practical. It doesn't always need to be a very huge emotional conversation. Sometimes normality is probably welcome. Then there's the social side of being widowed, particularly when most of the people around you are still couples. Maybe for years you went everywhere with your husband or wife. You had the same group of friends, you all went out for meals together, you travelled together, and you were invited to family occasions as a couple. Now, you're arriving alone, and sometimes invitations can stop. I don't think that always happens because people are being deliberately unkind. They may assume you just don't want to come. Or they may worry that you'll feel uncomfortable being surrounded by couples, or simply not know whether inviting you will make things worse. Personally, I think you should keep inviting people and let them decide. They may say no the first time, and they may say no 10 times, but perhaps the 11th time they really want to come. But if you stop asking altogether, a person who's already lost so much can start feeling as though they've lost their social life too. And that again takes me back to something the lady who contacted me said. She described sometimes feeling almost like a leper as an Asian widow. And that's an awful way for anyone to feel. Her husband died, but she didn't stop being who she was. She still has a personality. She still wants to laugh, wants friendship and conversation, and she still wants moments where life feels normal. She is a widow, but she's not only a widow. And I think sometimes that label can become the first thing people see, especially when a woman is still quite young. Before her husband died, she was a wife. She was a mum, a friend, a daughter, a colleague, and a woman in her own right. And afterwards, suddenly she can become the widow. And perhaps we need to remember that widowhood is something that happened to her. It isn't the whole of who she is. And there was something else she did while we were talking that really, really upset me. She apologised for talking about her husband so much. And I remember thinking, why on earth should you apologise? He was your husband and you loved him. You built a whole life with him. Of course you can talk about him. I think people can sometimes become frightened of mentioning a person who's died because they worry that saying their name will upset the widow or widower. But you haven't reminded them that their husband or wife died because they didn't forget. Sometimes hearing another person mention them or share a funny story, simply say their name can actually be comforting because it means someone else remembers them too. And maybe we need to become better at that. Remembering. We're very good in our communities when someone first dies. People come together and that support can be wonderful. But I do wonder what happens several years later. You don't have to constantly ask a widow or widower how they're coping, and I don't think most people would want every conversation to become about grief anyway. It can be far more normal than that. Keep them part of your life and keep inviting them. Remember that there may be certain dates that are difficult, and don't assume that because they went on holiday or wore something colourful or eventually met another person, they no longer miss the husband or wife they lost. Both things can exist at the same time. You can have a lovely day, and still miss someone, and you can build another life and still love the person who was part of the first one. And that's probably why this whole conversation has also made me wonder what support actually exists for younger Asian widows and widowers. Because not everyone wants counselling, and not everyone wants to go to a formal support group and sit in a circle talking about grief. Some people may find that really helpful, but others won't. Sometimes you might simply want to speak to another person who understands the cultural side of what you're dealing with, without having to explain everything from the beginning. Someone who understands why your relationship with your in-laws can suddenly become complicated, and why marriage can become a conversation involving the whole family rather than simply a decision about your own life. And maybe even why losing your husband doesn't only change your relationship status, it can change where you feel you fit in within a family, and sometimes within the wider community. Maybe we need more conversations about that. And I think we also need to keep widowers in that conversation, because men can experience their own set of expectations. A man may be encouraged to remarry, but that doesn't mean the process is easy for him. He may feel guilty even thinking about another woman, and he may worry about what his children will think. And he might be frightened that people will think he's forgotten his wife. And sometimes everyone is so busy telling him he needs another partner that no one actually asks whether that's what he wants. Because whether we are talking about a widow or a widower, I think that's what so much of this comes down to, and that's choice. My mum chose to wear her white and cream chunnis after losing her husband, and my mother-in-law dealt with losing hers very differently. But neither was wrong. Just like a widow who never wants another relationship isn't wrong, nor is a widow who meets someone else wrong. There can't be just one set of rules, because people, marriages, families, and grief are all different. And when I think about everything we've talked about today, I keep coming back to those examples close to me. My mum lost my dad and chose to change the way she dressed. My mother-in-law lost her husband and didn't make those same changes. But I do know that she thinks about him every single day. And when I lost my dad, I went back to work wearing lipstick. and another person looked at that lipstick and decided it meant something about my grief. It didn't, because there isn't a uniform for grief. Seeing a woman wearing bright colours tells you nothing about what happens when she gets home, and someone still struggling years later hasn't somehow failed because they haven't got over it. Perhaps we need to stop expecting people to prove their grief to us, and perhaps we need to stop deciding when we think they've grieved for long enough. The person who originally contacted us felt that younger Asian widows weren't really being talked about, and I think she had a point. There must be so many women and men living with these experiences who rarely hear them spoken about. And I'm sure there are adult children listening who recognise another part of this conversation too. Perhaps your mum or dad met someone after your other parent died, and you found it really difficult. That doesn't make you a bad person either. Grief can make all these relationships complicated. The important thing, I think, is recognising that your surviving parent having another person in their life doesn't remove the parent you lost. There should be room in a family for the person who died to still be loved and remembered, while the person who is still alive is allowed to carry on living. So before we finish, we would really like to hear from you. If any of these stories resonate with you, whether you're a widow or a widower, or an adult child who has struggled when a parent found a new partner, or maybe your relationship with your in-laws changed after losing your husband or wife, please get in touch with us. We'd like to hear what genuinely helped you and what didn't. Perhaps a person said something they thought was harmless, but you've never forgotten it. And maybe everyone rallied around when your husband or wife first died, but gradually the calls and the invitations became less. Perhaps you met a partner later in life, and the reaction from your children and your in-laws or your wider family wasn't what you expected. Maybe you never wanted another relationship at all, and everyone kept trying to persuade you that you should. And if you're from a South Asian background, we'd particularly like to hear whether culture and family gave you the support you needed, or whether some of those expectations made an already difficult situation even harder. We'd also really like to hear from the widowers, as there may be men listening who have never really had the opportunity to talk about how lonely they felt and how lost they were after their wife died, or how much their life changed because everyone around them expected them to be strong and just get on with it. And going back to the lady who originally contacted us and trusted us with her story, thank you. You started a conversation that we think we needed to have, and hopefully someone listening today will recognise a little of their own life in something we've talked about and realise that they aren't the only person feeling that way. We spend so much time remembering the person who died, and rightly so, we should remember them. But maybe we also need to become much better at remembering the person who's still here. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time on In-Laws Out Loud.